Welcome everybody to Visionality's Building Forward series. My name is Emily Barney and I'm the CEO and founder of Visionality. And we have a guest star today. I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Angela Fentiman, and she's going to give a brief introduction of herself, and then we're going to launch right into our topic.
Right, great. Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. So today we get to talk about the gender pay gap, which probably shouldn't be so excited about, but it's a really important topic, even though it's aggravating and frustrating. It's a really important topic. So I am a Ph.D. student at Pepperdine in the Global Leadership and Change program. I've been a professor for about 10 years and also had a long career in corporate communication. So now my research is actually focused on women in leadership, and gender pay gap is one of the areas that I've dug into recently. So when I was sharing that with Emily, we thought it would be a great conversation. So I'm looking forward to it.
I love it. All right, my friend, let's start our timer. Our whole spiel here is digging in a sassy fashion into a big topic, and we do it all in 25 minutes. So 3, 2, 1, go. All right. The jumping off point for today's discussion is that the gender pay gap is a larger systemic issue. It isn't just about, right, dollar to dollar. It's about gender justice and gender equity. So take me through, maybe discuss that a little bit, and then I want you to take me through the myths of the gender pay gap.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the things that I think we do a lot with systemic societal issues is we try to make them into an individual problem, right? So Emily, you don't get paid as much as the man who does your job because you just don't quite know how to negotiate as well. Or you made the decision to have a child and that took you out of the workforce. And these are a lot of the myths that we hear when people actually try to doubt the issue of the gender pay gap or deny its existence. They blame it on some of these other problems, but quite frankly, and in reality, this pay gap is part of a lot of these other problems, right? Because so if we take the issue of negotiation, women don't know how to negotiate. Women actually do know how to negotiate, but a lot of times, right, we get lowballed from the start. So we're negotiating from a deficit, which has definitely happened to me a couple of times in my career, where I was negotiating, but I was negotiating from a deficit. And also we look at women differently when they portray those types of behaviors that we consider more masculine, right? So a man who negotiates, savvy business person, knows what he's doing, that's a great thing. When a woman negotiates, we actually see it in the research that we think of her differently. Who does she think she is? She's so demanding. All of these negative characteristics are associated with women who ask for more. So it's not just that women, it's fundamentally unfair, right, to say that women don't know how to negotiate, because in fact, when we do, we can sometimes be penalized for it. So that's another issue. And then when we talk about this idea of, well, women leave the workforce, I was hearing a talk from a professor at George Mason in their Gender and Policy Institute, and she pointed out a really great fact about that is, why is that time period when women tend to have children also such a crucial point in our careers? That's arbitrary. Someone decided that. And likely we know who that was, right? That was men who held power, who decided that this was a prime time for career growth. But what happens is that puts women at a disadvantage, and men are not treated the same way when it comes to raising families, right? A man in a lot of, especially back in 50s, 60s, 70s, and even now, a man would get a raise for having a child because you have more people to take care of, versus a woman is penalized and her career is hurt by that decision. So it's just and we can go through many examples of this sort of inequality that we see that's bigger than just the pay gap, but we try to point to these things that are really just kind of false places to put the blame without really looking at the systemic issue.
Well, and I have definitely sat in meetings where the same thing occurred and the response was very different. A meeting where a woman's babysitter got sick and she was forced to bring her kids. And then she was doing double duty in that meeting, keeping her kids occupied and participating. And she was seen as unprofessional. Why doesn't she have it together? And I have also been in meetings where a man's babysitter got sick and everyone was so impressed at what a wonderful father he was to, step up and accommodate. And it's just been really disappointing. One of the founding principles, one of the reasons I built Visionality was to create an equitable workplace for parents and to enable parents to show up as their full selves in the workplace. And, we've talked about this a little bit before in this series, but we have an employee who's a mom of 3, and, she had to learn how to Zoom school her three little ones. And we have an all hands meeting every Monday. And she was keeping herself out of those Monday meetings because she didn't want the team to see her distracted. And we really pushed her and we said, this is the difference between equality and equity. Each of us need different tools to show up as our full self. And you being a parent is part of what makes you an incredible asset to this team. And yeah, that does require some accommodations that the people who aren't parents don't require, but that's okay. And that's what building an equitable workplace is. It's giving the appropriate tools to the appropriate individuals, and the tools are going to require different money. They're going to require different time, and that's what equity is. It's giving the individuals the tools to show up as their best self and recognizing that it's going to be different, and that's okay.
Right. Absolutely.
I have a question for you too. Because the gender pay gap exists, typically within, a 2-person household, that would mean that the woman makes less than a man if they're both working. And because that's a systemic issue, does that then lead to, when a child comes into the world, the woman giving up her career because it's less of a financial burden to the family? So we've built the system and then it perpetuates itself because it's systemic. And then the woman is, 4 years back in her career, 7 years back in her career, and it's really hard to re-enter. And so can you talk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, a couple of points on that's really important. So when we look at the gender pay gap overall, and we're going to talk about the racial inequality in that, I know a little bit later. But if we look just at, so the typical number that's cited in the pay gap is actually what white women make in comparison to white men, which is 82 cents on the dollar. If you look at the comparison of mothers to fathers, it's actually 70 cents to the dollar. So mothers actually make significantly less than the average of the pay gap. So the average pay gap is actually larger for mothers than it is for women in general. So that puts women absolutely at a disadvantage. The other thing, early on in the pandemic, I remember reading this article and it still makes me mad today. It was about this woman who had a successful business. She had a good amount of employees. Her husband was unemployed, but could not be bothered to take care of their toddler. So she ended up closing her business. All of those people lost their jobs just because the husband couldn't take care of essentially his own child. And we saw that decision happening over and over again, right? Where men's careers are prioritized over women. And this absolutely perpetuates it, right? If I learn, if you're in a position where you earn less than your partner, financially, that's how the numbers work out, right? If you're going to be depending on one income, you're going to want the higher income. So it absolutely perpetuates that problem. And, it really is this is an issue that has to be managed from a policy perspective. It just does. And so let me see here, I want to get my dates correct. So in the early 60s, 1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act. That is the last time we had any type of federal legislation on this issue.
Give me that date again.
1963, John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act. So there was a bill introduced called the Paycheck Fairness Act, because as great as Equal Pay Act is, and it did give us a little boost, but in about 60 years, we've only closed the gender pay gap by about 20 cents to the dollar. So we've still got almost 20 cents to go. And again, that's different depending on race as well. But that gap, if we continue at that pace, that gap will not close in our lifetimes, Emily. So there was a Paycheck Fairness Act that was introduced in recent years, and it actually passed the House in April of this year, but then it failed to pass the Senate. But what it does is it actually closes a lot of the gaps in the Equal Pay Act, because employers are still able to say, oh, well, it really wasn't because she was a woman, it was because of merit or hours, getting back into some of those larger systemic problems that we use to justify the gender pay gap.
Well, so you're the expert in this. Doesn't the law say equal pay for equal work, right? But that is so subjective. And what we already just covered is nobody's work is actually equal. We each require different accommodations to show up as our full self. And so like, there are just so many, like, not even knowing anything about this, I can see so many holes in that statement, equal pay for equal work, because no one's work is equal.
Right.
So yeah, so what does that even mean? And talk to me more about what this new legislation would have done.
Right. So the Paycheck Fairness Act, and good news is, even though it failed to pass this year, it's going to be introduced in the next Congress. I actually spoke with a fellow from the National Women's Law Center who confirmed that that is the plan. So that will be one that we can rally around when it does get reintroduced. But basically, it really tries to eliminate disparities. It limits an employer's ability to claim that pay difference are based on a factor other than sex, and it enhances some of the non-retaliation prohibitions. So and it also makes it illegal to force employees to sign a waiver that prohibits them from disclosing their wage information. So some employers use that, right? Some employers say, oh, you can't talk about wages, to hide the fact that there are significant pay gaps. And that actually happened to me early on in my career. I found out a male colleague who had less experience, but the same level of manager title. He had only had internships. I had had a couple full-time jobs at this point, post-college, and found out that he was making significantly more than me, probably, and based on from what they offered me, it was about 10 grand more. And then I had negotiated up an additional about 5 grand. So it was still making considerably more. I found out that the initial response was, how did you find out? Not the fact that it was a problem, that I was more qualified, had more experience, and was a better performer at the job. But the problem was that I found out, not the fact that, and this is something that we do, I think we find over and over again in organizations, is we're more quick to paint the person who points out the problem as the problem than we are to look at the actual problem itself.
Do we have data on if the gender pay gap is bigger or smaller when you look at large organizations versus small organizations, or, local or national or global?
I haven't really dug into that aspect of the research. I imagine, I think it depends a lot on the organization So I could see differences based on size, but that's not something that I've looked at closely in the research. The one part of the research, though, that is incredibly upsetting, and when I presented this research to some colleagues a few months back, it was over the summer, the aspect of it that really got people pretty worked up was the pay gap by race and gender. So as I mentioned before, white women earn an average about 82 cents to the dollar for men. So that's about an 18-cent pay gap. Asian women in total earn about 87 cents to the dollar for white men, but it's not equally distributed among Asian cultures. So we'll see that for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women, it's actually 63 cents, which is the same amount for Black women as well. Black women earn about 63 cents on average to every dollar for a white man. And then Native Americans, it's about 60%. And then Latinx is actually 55%. Or 55 cents, excuse me. So we're looking about half what a white man would earn per dollar for a Latinx woman. So when we look at the intersectionality of this issue, I think it becomes even more pressing and more serious, because we're not just looking, like 82 cents sounds bad, but 55 cents is, we should be ashamed.
Yes. Yes. How do we see this play out specifically in the nonprofit industry?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, and when we look at the larger issues around, again, coming back to those systemic issues, as a society, we tend to undervalue the work that women do. And we've seen this in a few examples in the gender pay gap, where we've actually gotten pay equity in certain areas. The salaries have gone down. So healthcare is one of the areas. Yeah, this was, again, the conversation that I had with the professor at George Mason, is that, so healthcare is, we've gotten better pay equity for doctors and more women in doctor roles. The overall pay in the industry has gone down. And a couple of other areas where we see this, right, is K through 12 education, another field that is mostly women, but very, very, very far below what we should be paying for that type of work. And the nonprofit industry is another one of those. Again, largely dominated by women in the field. And basically the assumption is, well, we can get women who can work for nothing, because if their husbands have good jobs, then we don't have to pay them.
If their husbands have good jobs and, oh, you're doing good work, so that should be your compensation. And it's like the opposite. The people in our industry are dealing with the hardest societal challenges, and with harder work should come better compensation. Mm-hmm. And by the way, like better benefits packages, because you're doing really hard stuff. So maybe you want to see a therapist or take a yoga class or take a vacation, by the way.
Absolutely.
So it actually should be the opposite. With harder work comes greater compensation.
Yeah. Well, and self-care in the nonprofit industry, and anyone who provides those types of services is so important. And just having those resources and having the ability to be able to care for yourself so you can care for others is incredibly important. But I think the pay disparity that we see in the nonprofit world definitely stems from this larger issue that we see around undervaluing the work that women do. And so if it's a field that more women tend to be drawn to, the wages tend to be lower. I mean, we even see this in the communication field, another field that tends to be a lot more women who are in the doing side of it. But like those other fields, we see much more, we see men in the leadership positions, and those are the positions that are better compensated.
Which is similar to what we see in nonprofit land, which is typically women are the ones in the trenches doing the day-to-day functional work. And then we have more men in the executive director position or on the board making decisions about the pay of the women who are working alongside them.
Mhm. Yeah.
So for the decision makers who are watching this, what can we do? What are some things that we can take action on within our own organizations or on our own boards to start to improve this?
Yeah. Pay women more. I mean, I think that's kind of the easiest and maybe a little too obvious solution, but pay value women. Don't, if a woman negotiates for what she's worth and a woman knows her value, don't penalize her for that. Take a step back and question why are you feeling negatively about a woman asking for what she wants and what she deserves. We also have Paycheck Fairness Act. When that comes back into Congress, support that. Call your representatives, tell them you want to see that legislation get passed. And then also, I think that there are other workplace policies that help support things like equal pay. And one of those is family leave and paternity leave, right? Because when one of the places, and I think the most likely way that we're going to see gender equity in the workplace is when we have more gender equity at home. And when it becomes normalized that men also are responsible for caring for children, and that takes away from the work that they do, because that's a reality of having a family and having children. You have human beings who depend on you. So that means certain sacrifices, certain times of day when you're maybe not available because you have to pick the kids up or take them somewhere. And so to make that more of a task that's shared by parents, and not saying that men should be penalized for it, that's not the argument at all. It's that no parent should be penalized for that. And again, really, no employee should be penalized for having a life outside of work. Work does not have to be our lives. And we come into the workplace better, well-rounded, interesting people when we have lives outside of work. And so whether you choose to have a family or not, your time outside of the office should be honored, and that should create an opportunity. And really, those types of solutions, creating a workplace like you have, Emily, where it really recognizes individual differences and creates a space where everyone can thrive and bring those to the table, that's a huge step in looking at pay equity issues, because you're not going to judge people differently based on their circumstances, right? You're going to say, how can I make this a place where great people can thrive?
Well, and honestly, it's expensive, like it is expensive, and accommodations are expensive, and you get better work out of people and they stick around longer, and full stop, turnover is my biggest expense. And so anything that I can do to bring out the best in my employees and get them to show up as their full selves, they're going to work harder, they're going to do better work, and they're going to stick around longer, which means I actually make more money, which, by the way, then I can pay them more, and then they stick around longer. So it really is like, I'm going to be the first one to say it is expensive, and that investment pays dividends that don't show up on your balance sheet. And that's what is so insidious about this. Like, you can see the expenses on your balance sheet, but you can't see the return, because that turnover expense or that lost productivity, because people don't feel good when they actually sit down at their computer, doesn't show up as a line item. So yeah, it's really a double-edged sword, where you see the expenses and you don't necessarily see the revenue, unless you're really acknowledging that that's a fact. So we probably have 2 minutes left, 1 minute, 45 seconds. Last final thoughts.
No, I think what you said was great, because that's what we call a virtuous circle, right? It's the opposite of a vicious circle. A virtuous circle builds on itself and creates more of what you want. And the thing about it is those line items are quantitative. You can put numbers to them. It's just not an observation. If you want to see it, you can do it. And I think too often we make excuses about why it's hard or why things are the way they are. Like, oh, women don't negotiate well, women have kids. We make all these excuses. But if we get to the heart of it, we can actually see the damage this is causing from a societal standpoint. And think about it. I mean, the loss of income for women, if you're talking about that significant amount of a paycheck, it's just, it shouldn't be happening, and it's fairly easy to fix, and we make it harder than it is.
Well, and everyone's talking right now about the Great Resignation, and it's so hard to find good employees. And we have built these structures that don't allow parents to show up. And like, it's actually easy. And like, parents are really good employees. And so it just, we have created these false constructs. And like before the pandemic, it was impossible for most jobs to be remote. Impossible. Well, guess what? Lots of us figured out how to do it. And so like the reason we're calling this series Building Forward is I don't want to go back to normal. Normal was bad for a lot of people. And we have now realized the importance of like self-care and therapy and work-life balance. And we have all created this ability to work from home now, which for most people really improves their quality of life. And that's for parents, that's people with mobility challenges or other disabilities, people who just like to have fun on the weekends, like it's better.
Dog parents.
It's better. Working from home is better. Like I'm going to throw a little laundry in after this, right? Like it enables us to live a much more balanced and equitable and integrated life. So like, let's not go back to normal. Normal was bad.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's a great place to end. Normal was bad. Let's not go back. Pay women.
Pay women.
Pay women.
All right. And with that, my friends, we have come to the end.